How do we know that the current chronology that the mainstream has ingrained into the Western world is correct? How do we know that all of these dates with respect to something like ancient Egypt, Rome, Greece, all the civilizations in South America, Africa, India, it doesn't matter. Any civilization, any ancient civilization, anything that existed essentially, I would say, before the 14th century AD and back, how do we know that the chronology that mainstream academia currently employs is real? How do we know that this is correct? This might sound like a stupid question at first, but ask yourself this question. Have you ever gone and looked at any of these ancient dates that the mainstream currently touts as being correct and demanded 100% scientific proof that the date that the mainstream is giving for a particular ancient period in time is correct? Have you ever done that? And ask yourself honestly and answer yourself honestly. So for example, we're going to discuss Rome in this show, and I'm going to do my best to stick to the topic that I have chosen. I will try to not get off track. So that's my goal today, is to actually try to focus up and do real... Okay, anyway, so Rome. What was it that gave you confidence that the dating period for classical Rome between around 700-ish BC to 400-ish AD is correct? What is it that convinced you as a researcher, as a historian, that this particular date is correct? What I find is this kind of a question is essentially almost never asked by the researchers that believe in this particular kind of data. Most historians, when they go to learn and research history, they will just build upon the established chronology that has been built up by, all of the absolute most corrupt institutions you could imagine, objectively. But what happens is that historians will use what these institutions have created, in this case mainstream chronology, or more to the point, Scaligerrian chronology, Scaligerrian-Petavius chronology. They will use this as a backbone to continue their own research. Now, there's a few problems here. The first problem, like I said, ask yourself the question, what convinced you that these dates were right? Now, your average academician is going to come at me with all kinds of books. They're going to be like, oh, look, Titus Livy wrote this, or Tacitus wrote that, or, blah, blah. They're going to have all of these books that they will throw at me, and they'll say, see, all of these people say it's real, so it must be real. Really? Okay, so our first problem here is that we are relying on material that we know for a fact, a scientific fact, did not show up until the Renaissance era. Most people don't actually realize this, but the vast majority of the work that we know Rome from materializes during this period of time, around like I said, the Renaissance period. You could argue 1200-ish AD to all the way up until 1800s, actually. It's funny, even until I believe the early 20th century, we were miraculously finding books that suddenly started to really piece together Rome exactly how the Scaligerrian chronology deemed it to be correct. So this is obviously a problem. Mainstream historians quite literally right now deem all of these works that were miraculously discovered during this period of time as 100% true. Now, there are a couple of tomes here and there that mainstream has acquiesced on to say that, yeah, okay, maybe some of that is forged, but the remainder of it is totally real, bro. Everything else is 100% correct. Yes, even that stuff we started finding in the 19th and 20th century that miraculously showed up that had to prove other aspects of unproven Scaligerrian chronology. Yes, all of this is real. This is literally the mainstream historians' point of view. They honestly believe that any book that was discovered essentially during the Renaissance period of time is 100% accurate and can be admitted into the chronology of history. They have no problem doing this. It literally, well, what happens is that these people literally believe that all of these books are true unless there is some huge glaring piece of evidence that would prove it being a forgery. So that already we have a problem, because we're already assuming that potential forgeries are correct. So if I did a good enough forgery basically back in the day, that means if nobody catches me, mainstream historians are going to believe that my forgery is real. This is a huge issue, and this is the foundational problem with Roman chronology. Where does Roman chronology come from? Where the hell did we get all of these dates? Why do we think there are 3 separate Roman empires? Like, where did all of this crazy stuff come from? So, like I said, the first piece of evidence that historians will use, and they're the backbone of quite a lot of their scholarship, would be all of these books that show up during the Renaissance period of time. This is one of the backbones for Roman chronology. And like I already said, we have a huge problem using those kinds of pieces of evidence to substantiate any kind of a chronology on the simple basis of we know for a scientific fact that during the period where all of these works were discovered, we know that forgery was literally a business in and of itself. I mean, there was a thriving market, a supply and demand situation for forged historical documents. All right, this is not contested, this exists. The only people that choose to turn a blind eye to this factual situation are mainstream historians. And we know why. The reason is simple. They don't want to lose their job. They've been psychologically conditioned into believing that their position is 100% correct. But like I asked you at the very beginning of this show, have you ever asked those people for scientific evidence that corroborates their chronological claims based on those sources, those written sources? We're going to do a little bit of that here, but I mean, ask yourself that question, and ask yourself that question for the rest of your life. I don't care what date it is for whatever civilization. Ask yourself, how did this establishment establish this kind of a precedence? Where did this data come from that really convinced all of these historians that this chronology is correct? Right? So, of course, the next thing you can throw at me would be, oh, well, yeah, but what about archaeology, bro? We've got everything all dated, right? It's all there. We dug up all of this stuff, right? Okay, well, here's another problem. And this is probably the largest problem that historians and archaeologists completely ignore, and that is the fact that archaeology itself does not support any of the current Scaligerrian-Petavius claims with respect to how Rome's chronology played out. And this is a scientific fact. There is no way around this. If you look at the stratigraphy regarding Rome, we do not have the archaeological evidence to substantiate any of the claims that are currently made by the mainstream historians. Now, I know that sounds crazy, because of course you should be asking yourself right now, but I thought these guys were really smart. I mean, aren't they in their positions of power because, they're telling the truth, and because they're, they've got all the good evidence and they know what they're talking about? Come on now. Now, we all know that that is not how power works. All you have to do is toe the line. As long as you support the current narrative, that will put you into a position within that institution that will give you power. And then as long as you just continue to support that lie, then you'll be fine, right? And of course, what has happened in the Western world is that now we have essentially deified, all of academia, because we believe that these people are all hyper smart, telling the truth. And that, of course, if any of them were lying, then other scientists would call them out, right? Well, other scientists have called these people out, but of course, those scientists are ignored for the simple fact that the evidence that they are supplying goes completely against the current chronological narrative. And that's a fact. and there's no way around it. We know for a fact that there are no paradigm shifts allowed now in history. You're not allowed to do it. If you try to shift the paradigm, you are immediately labeled a conspiracy theorist, right? And you are excommunicated from whatever particular academic school you are involved in. So we are going to focus on Rome, and it's really important that everybody understands that scientifically speaking, from fact, there's no way around this. What I'm saying right here is a scientific fact. We do not possess the evidence to corroborate the current historical narrative when it comes to ancient Rome. That might sound like a crazy claim, but what do you want from me? The evidence is right there. You don't have to trust me. Go look at it yourself, right? It's all over there. You can go and you can see how the archaeologists have to manipulate their findings to try and fit these findings into the Staggering chronology. It's funny because that's not how archaeology should be working at all, right? The reality is, anytime we do archaeological digs, the digs themselves should be setting the standard for the chronology, not the other way around. But this is the situation that we find within the archaeological field. Whenever anybody does archaeology nowadays, if they make findings that contradict the current mainstream chronology, what happens? Well, you only have two options, right? The first option is that you display your findings and then you are immediately dismissed. Or you take your findings and you look at the mainstream chronology and you try to somehow manipulate those findings to fit into the current chronology. Is that how science is supposed to be done? I mean, serious question. Is this really how we should be doing archaeology? If an archaeologist finds something that goes against the mainstream chronology, which is quite literally like every single day of our lives at this point in time, the archaeology should dictate the chronology, but it doesn't. This is a problem. So I only wanted to talk for 12,000 hours here really fast to set the stage for anybody who is not prepared to hear the possibility that what we think we know about Rome is completely wrong. I just backed it up by science. Scientifically speaking, we do not have the evidence to support the current chronology, and that is a fact. There is nothing to argue here. Like I said, go look at the evidence yourself, and if you look at it objectively, and I mean step back, third person, really try to look at it from a fresh perspective. Once you do this, what happens is that at the bare minimum, you have no choice, absolutely zero scientific choice, but to admit that the mainstream chronology is wrong and that archaeology is not being paid attention to. And it takes all of 2 seconds of looking at the evidence, by the way, to prove this. And we've done a couple of shows on some of this, but there's a lot more to go. And we're going to talk about some of that in this show. But this show is going to be a little more extreme than I think a lot of people might be prepared for. So right now, classical Rome is considered to have existed by the mainstream between the 8th century BC all the way up until the 5th century AD. That's a long time for one particular civilization to exist. This is actually another subject that I don't think people really ever think about either, but we have no problem when we look at history. It's saying that certain empires lasted for 800 years or 2,000 years or 1,000 years or whatever, right? And nobody bats an eye when somebody makes this claim. Now, it's not just because, they're not paying attention to the evidence or anything, but, the reality is even before you were to look at any evidence whatsoever, the fact that somebody is willing to make the claim that a human civilization essentially thrived for 1,000+ years untouched and unchanged, that is a very weird claim. And the reality is, it doesn't make any sense scientifically. Why doesn't a claim about a 1,000+ year civilization make any sense? Well, it's simple. We have 0 examples of any civilization existing today that has existed untouched for over 1,000 years. There's no such thing. Every civilization that exists right now has been influenced not only recently by modern stuff, but you can see the influences from other cultures all throughout the world, oddly enough, embedded into any currently existing society. So there is no such thing today as an untouched society that lasted for 1,000 years. Why do we believe that back in the day, a couple thousand years ago or whatever, that civilizations could have survived for 1,000 years untouched? Where does this train of thought come from? I mean, there's no real reason for it. We have no scientific basis to believe that this is a possibility. So why is it that when we look back in ancient history, not just in the Roman Mediterranean area, but all over the world, we find a situation to where historians have no problem claiming that all the kinds of civilizations, lasted for 500 years, 800 years, 1,000 plus years untouched, right? The culture it stood there, it was a very specific culture, and then it stagnated for hundreds and hundreds of years and didn't change until one day it did. That is literally the position of a mainstream historian. Why is this a problem? Well, it flies in the face of observational science and human psychology. Right now, we can look around this entire planet and there's no civilization that has existed untouched for thousands of years. There's just no such thing. Right? And that's observational evidence. We can look around right now and see that. That is a very, very important piece of scientific evidence. The fact that right now we can look around and make that claim and say it's true and have the evidence to back it up right in front of our faces. Again, I'm repeating myself, but do you see what I'm saying? Right now we can look around and say that's impossible. So why do historians believe that, for example, classical Rome could have existed for 1,000 plus years essentially unchanged? This flies in the face of everything that we currently know about civilization building in the modern times. For example, all we have to do is look around and we can see, we experience this right now every single day of our lives. We can see how human civilizations, how they evolve, how they change, what changes a civilization, etc., etc. This is all scientific evidence. This evidence goes a long way into proving that this is not how human society works. Human society will not stay unchanged for more than a millennium. Right? It won't even stay unchanged for more than 100 years. This whole concept of nothing ever changing for long periods of time, this is directly derived from that horrible theory of uniformitarianism. Because right now, everybody and their mom in the mainstream believes that everything happens on this really slow basis. And not just geological processes, right? Whenever we talk about the theory of uniformity, usually people think cosmologically, geologically, those kinds of stuff. But the reality is that thought process of uniformitarianism has also now been applied to human history. So people have no problem now saying that a civilization can last and stay, unchanged for essentially 1,000 years, because of course the theory of uniformity supports that conclusion. This is a horrible way to do history, because first of all, the theory of uniformity is trash. And I'm going to make a show on that. We're going to go and we're going to completely just destroy that one day. But anyway, that's a garbage theory. And also, we have no reason to believe whatsoever archaeologically that any of these civilizations existed for more than 1,000 years. For example, I'll stick to the topic, classical Rome. The classical Rome had essentially a 1,000-year period of just prosperity and just essentially being Rome untouched. So right off the bat, we do not have the archaeology that supports this concept, and nor should we believe it's possible anyway, for the simple fact that a 1,000-year untouched, unchanged civilization flies in the face of basic human psychology. That anybody who wants to have any kind of an understanding of human history has got to have an intrinsic understanding of base human psychology. Now, when I say base, I don't just mean base as in, the basics, the kind of the fundamentals and, you kind of get it and then you move on. That's not what I mean. What I mean is really looking at the human animal, the human's animal's psychological makeup. Look at what a human is capable of. Look at how a human is capable of being manipulated, and look at how humans will evolve their psychology relative to their environment and what changes can come out of that purely based on how a human or a human, or humans feel about a situation. There is no psychological reason to believe that humans stayed stagnant in any civilization across this planet for 800, 900, 1,000 plus years. Humans do not operate in this way. It sounds really good to say that there was some 1,000-year-long civilization in a textbook, right? A couple of sentences, people read it, they don't really think about it, they say, okay, well, I guess these guys are smart, they know what they're talking about, right? And then they believe it and they move on. The reality is we have no scientific reason from a human psychological aspect to believe that humans would just stay put in one area for 1,000 years and their culture would not change all that much. We know for a fact that that is not how things work. Even more interesting, of course, is these cultures' histories themselves do not make any claims to surviving for a true 1,000+ years. I know some cultures will say, hundreds of thousands of years for this or that. But of course, the temporal situation in those stories gets weird relative to what they are truly trying to explain. And I'm not going to get into all of that, but I'm just throwing that out there because I know that there is a smartass out there who's going to do that, and that's a whole other subject. So we're not going to talk about that. Stop getting me off course. Shut up. Okay. So, what I want to present today, I want to present to you guys a different point of view relative to our understanding of classical Rome. Now, there are a few reasons why we need to reanalyze the dating with respect to classical Rome. Obviously, the first one is we would just like to get, classical Rome dated correctly, right? That's just a very basic, obviously that's what we should be doing. But there are further ramifications for correctly dating classical Rome. If Rome is not dated the current way that the mainstream chronologists date everything within classical Rome, that means that if classical Rome's dating changes, then other archaeological dates based on the Roman chronology will then also have to change. This is probably one of the main things and main reasons why historians do not want paradigm shifts. Because if you shift one paradigm in just one culture, if you radically change, say for example, the dating of classical Rome, that means any other date of the surrounding area that was based on that classical dating has to then be shifted. And then, of course, if another date has to be shifted in another culture, there might be another set of histories that were using that culture's dating system to date those cultures. An entire cascade effect is then put into motion, which means that everything that all of these historians believe in is 100% literally false, and they essentially have to start at square one. And I get it, people don't want to do that, but it doesn't matter. Scientifically speaking, if we have to change a date, then we need to change the date. There's no way around this, all right? There's no bargaining with this. This is why this is all the proof you really need that mainstream history is completely false. On a scientific basis, by the way. This is not conspiracy theory garbage. This is a scientific fact. If historians will not allow a paradigm shift that should come about due to finding physical evidence that demands it, all right, then that means history is wrong. That means mainstream chronology is objectively wrong. Now, we know that mainstream chronology is objectively wrong. We'll prove it wrong again in this show, but at this point in time, mainstream chronology is an absolute joke. So whenever you see somebody, happily quoting dates about classical Rome, ask them, how did you get those dates, bro? Like, show me the scientific proof that proves that that date is that date for sure. Right? And they're going to have nothing. They're just going to try, they'll fumble around. They'll be like, oh, but dendrochronologist said, shut up. Dendrochronology is trash. But radiocarbon dating, just choke that person out, dude. Just radiocarbon dating, just shut up. slap them again. Ah! Grab their head, smash it into the wall, and then drag it across the floor of the tile, break the tile, and then stick it in their eye and start gouging it. In today's show, we are going to go over a small section in a book written by A.T. Fomenko called Dark Ages in Medieval History. There's a lot of these little books that he put out there, and they're just full of amazing information. But anyway, we're going to cover a small part with respect to Rome that really does set the stage for Rome being dated completely inaccurately. Now, this focuses mostly on classical Rome, so this would have been sort of like the first Roman Empire situation. But of course, this will have ramifications for the other empires, which then, of course, will eventually prove that there was not three empires, there was only one Roman Empire period, and blah, blah. Okay, anyway, so we're going to go over this. Let's just see what he has to say. I'm not saying that you have to agree with everything in here, but he presents a scientific case, that's backed up by evidence. This is the kind of stuff that might be initially hard to hear, especially if you're Western trained and you're ingrained into the mainstream chronology. But, the reality is the evidence is what the evidence is. And like I already said, mainstream chronologists, we know for a scientific fact that they are no longer operating in good faith. So that means something has to change. So let's see what we can find here in this section. Let's see what the evidence is that Fomenko has, and then maybe we can use that to build up a case, not only for changing the chronology of Rome, but, of the general area. This will also, by the way, give us a completely different picture with respect to Byzantium or Constantinople, whatever you want to call it. Because in classical, or not class, anyway, in that area, one of the weird historical situations that has always had a problem, I've always had a problem with, has always been that Western and then Eastern Roman Empire situation. That whole topic doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense from just a basic critical thinking perspective. Just kind of looking at it and being like, really? Really? That's what they did? Like, why? What? But also, when you start to look at the evidence and how mainstream presents, the East-West situation, it's weird. It's just full of holes. It's just very awkward. So we do have precedents for looking into this and trying to see what the hell actually happened. Okay, I'm done talking. Let's get to the book. Before we begin, yes, I realize I suck at reading, and I'm sorry. That's why I highly recommend going and getting these books, or at the very least, just reading along with me on the screen. Either way, I will do my best, and let's see if we can tear apart more of the mainstream chronology. So, like I said, this book is out of, Dark Ages in Medieval History. It's a history, fiction, or science book, and it's the fourth book in the series. All right, so we're going to start in Chapter 4 area. We're going to start with 4.1. How Petrarch created the legend of the glorious Italian Rome out of nothing. According to our reconstruction, the Classical Age is merely another name applied in Staggering chronology to the medieval epoch of the 11th to 15th century A.D. Isn't that crazy? So for me, I know I'm going to try not to comment too much because we have a lot to read. But the claim here is that classical Rome did not exist from 700 BC to 300 AD or whatever, or 400 AD. But Fomenko is actually making the claim that the Rome that we think about from that period of time existed between the 11th and 15th centuries AD. Like, that's one hell of a claim, right? So, this is how messed up our history is. I mean, it's absolutely... Okay, all right. As we have already mentioned, the Italian Rome was apparently founded as a capital as late as the 14th century of the New Era, and not in the 8th century BC, as Staggering chronology tells us. It would thus be more interesting to regard the history of the medieval Rome from the point of view from this reconstruction. Nowadays, we are told that the Italian Rome entered the, quote, age of decline, unquote, in the epoch of the 13th and 14th century. Our take is that there is really a very simple explanation. Before the 14th century AD, Rome, if it had existed at all, had been a rather small town. This is why the medieval documents that have reached our age fail to see anything worthy of mentioning. Yeah, it's an interesting point, actually. The historians of a later age, raised on Scaligerine chronology, began to interpret this mutism as evidence of, quote, the utter decline of the Roman capital and all of its former splendor, unquote. According to our reconstruction, in the 14th century, the small Italian town of Rome was officially decreed on paper to be the capital of the great ancient Rome. To this end, the events which had really occurred in a completely different Rome, the Rome on the Bosphorus, the city of the Tsars, Constantinople, a truly great city of the Middle Ages, were transferred to the Italian Rome. Again, only formally on paper. See, this is one of the highlights that I don't think a lot of people understand when they look at Rome. So much of the stuff that we believe that Rome did or existed in or whatever is literally based on just written accounts from the Renaissance period that show up, I should say, during the Renaissance period. I honestly think that people believe that we have found these huge Roman libraries, under the dirt or whatever. For some weird reason, it would be, why are we digging out ruins, by the way? But anyway, people, I honestly believe, they probably think that we uncovered some huge library of ancient Roman documents, and then we could just read those documents because it was straight from them, and then we could piece together the history. That is not at all what happened, right? All of the documentation that we have with respect to ancient Rome literally comes from books magically appearing during the Renaissance period. All right, you guys get it. All right. Where were we? Okay. A large part of Constantinople's history was severed and attributed to the Italian Rome. Interestingly enough, we are in a position to give a more or less precise assessment of when this, quote, surgical transplantation of history, unquote, really took place. Let us turn to the 14th century history. In 1974, the world celebrated 600 years since the death of Francesco Petrarch, 1304 to 1374. The first prominent writer of the Middle Ages who, according to Leonardo Bruni, quote, had been the first who could understand and bring into light the ancient elegance and the style that had been forlorn and forgotten before. That's actually, unquote, that's actually an interesting point too, because there's a huge gap in time, by the way, relative to our understanding of Rome. Remember, we have all these weird gaps in history, and a lot of them are just called like the Greek Dark Age or the European Dark Age or whatever. These Dark Ages, they never existed, right? But it's funny. We have a period to where people just forget stuff exists, right? There are people who should have been Romans wandering around who should have been well aware of their past, but nobody knew about any of this stuff, right? Okay, anyway, let's keep going. Okay, what am I talking about? Okay. The actual personality of Petrarch is nowadays perceived as mysterious, vague, and largely unclear, and reality often becomes rather obfuscated. But we are talking about the events of the 14th century here. The true dating of the texts ascribed to Petrarch often remains thoroughly unclear. Already an eminent poet, Petrarch entered the second period of his life, the period of wandering. Petrarch, just so everybody knows, was one of the main people that, quote unquote, would have brought Rome to life for the general public. So that's already a problem in and of itself, by the way, the fact that people were not doing this en masse because they should have known about all this crap. All right, you get it. In the alleged year of 1333, he traveled around France, Flanders, and Germany, Quote, during his European travels, Petrarch became directly acquainted with scientists, searching the libraries of various monasteries, trying to find forgotten ancient manuscripts, and studying the monuments to the past glory of Rome, unquote. Remember, during this period of time, there is a huge thirst for any kind of documentation about, history generally. Of course, because, some people were innocently looking for this stuff, to be fair. I don't want to mischaracterize everybody back in the day as being essentially forgers and criminals. There were people trying to find legitimate ancient tomes, and there was stuff to find. And unfortunately, all the old stuff was magically burned and destroyed once they had made their new copy of the text, right? That was pretty common. Anyway, people were looking around for this stuff because there actually would have been some stuff to find, because they would have been closer to the ancients back then than we are now, right? So there would have been innocent people, but it was it was a huge craze. People were looking for this stuff, and, for various reasons, rather for good or bad. Okay. Nowadays, it is assumed that Petrarch became one of the first and most vehement advocates of the, quote, ancient, unquote, authors who, as we are beginning to understand, were either his contemporaries or preceded him by 100 or 200 years at the most. That's going to be important. Remember that. In 1337, he visited the Italian Rome for the first time. What did he see there? Petrarch writes, if these are indeed his real letters and not the result of subsequent editing. We have to be careful with that. God, that's the problem. Anytime we read something that is supposedly supposed to be an ancient text, you have no idea what you're reading. You have no idea if it's a legitimate copy of an older copy, if it's a, half legitimate and then other garbage was thrown in there. Like, this is a serious issue. The fact that mainstream historians have no problem making the claims that they make, dude. It's just absolutely insane that they do not, they don't even acknowledge these. The beginning of every single paper on Rome should begin with a warning. Warning, we actually don't know if these documents that we are sourcing are legitimately real. Like, that is literally what should be happening. And it's not, because people, okay. God, this stuff just absolutely angers me. Okay, calming down, let's do this. Quote, Rome seemed even greater to me than I could have imagined, especially the greatness of her ruins, unquote. And that would have been Petrarch. Rome in particular, and 14th century Italy in general, had met Petrarch with an utter chaos of legends, from which the poet had selected the ones he considered congruent to his a priori opinion of the greatness of Italian Rome. Basically, he filtered information. How do you like that? If Petrarch was a legitimate dude, and he probably was, I don't know, even if he was legitimate right here, we know for a fact that he sifted through information, discarded stuff that he did not like, and then wrote down the stuff that he did. And now that is what history of Rome is based on. Is that right? I mean, do you really believe we should operate like that? It's insane. All right. Apparently, Petrarch was among those who initiated the legend of the great ancient Italian Rome without any solid basis. Without any. No, zero, nada. He just started writing, listening to people. A significant amount of real medieval evidence of the correct history of Italy in the Middle Ages was rejected as erroneous. It would be of the utmost interest to study these medieval anachronisms, considered preposterous nowadays, if only briefly. According to the medieval legends, Anthenor's sepulchre was located in Padua. In Milan, the statue of Hercules was worshipped. The inhabitants of Pisa claimed their town to have been founded by Pelepsis. The Venetians claimed Venice to have been built of the stones of the destroyed Troy. Really? The Venetians claimed Venice was... Wow, huh. That's a good one. All right. Achilles was supposed to have ruled in Abruzza, Diomedes in Apulia, Agamemnon in Sicily, Eurydice in Piedmont, Hercules in Calabria. Apollo was rumored to have been an astrologer, the devil, and the god of the Saracens. Plato was considered a doctor, Cicero a knight and a troubadour, Virgil a mage who blocked the crater of the Vesuvius, etc. Yeah, that's interesting, huh? Okay. All of this is supposed to have taken place in the 14th century or even later. For example, we now know that Plato may legitimately have been a guy named Pletho who was writing under the alias of Plato so that he wouldn't be, executed for what he was writing. I've already done a show on that, but see how all of this stuff lines up? Like, if you look at the real evidence and you ask basic questions, everything changes, but what you actually find starts to make a lot more sense, and it's all connected at the end of the day. All right, anyway. This chaos of information obviously irritated Petrarch, who had come to Rome already having an a priori idea of the antiquity of the Italian Rome. It is noteworthy that Petrarch left us no proof of the antiquity of Rome that he postulates. On the contrary, his letters, if they are indeed his real letters, and not later edited copies, paint an altogether different picture. Roughly speaking, it is as follows. Petrarch is convinced that there should be many great buildings of ancient times in Rome. He really finds none of these buildings. He is confused and writes about it. Quote, "Where are the Thermae of Diocletian and Caracalla? Where is the Timbrium of Marius? The Spetsozanium of the Thermae of Severus? Where is the Forum of Augustus and the Temple of Mars the Avenger? Where are the holy places of Jupiter the Thunder-bearer on the Capitol and Apollo on the Palatine? Where is the portico of Apollo and the basilica of Caius and Lucius? Where is the portico of Libya and the theater of Marcellus? Where are the temple of Hercules and the Muses built by Marius Philip, and the temple of Diana built by Lucius Cornelius? Where is the temple of free arts of Avinius Pollio? Where is the theater of Balbus, the amphitheater of the Statulus Taurus? Where are the numerous constructions erected by Agrippa, of which only the Pantheon remains? Where are the splendorous palaces of the emperors? One finds everything in the books. One tries to find them in the city. One discovers that they either disappeared or that only the vaguest of their traces remain." Unquote. How do you like that? Even a historian back during this time period is like, where the hell is all this Roman stuff that is supposed to exist? It's funny. The dude is, whether he's, real or not, or his letters are real or not, he's asking the real questions here. Like, it's a legitimate question. Where the hell is everything? Even back then, they didn't know where everything was. But nowadays, modern scientists know everything? Like, what else going on, man? I mean, what the hell's happening? All right. These countless inquiries of where this or the other object might be, especially the final phrase, are amazing. They indicate that Petrarch came to Italian Rome with an a priori certainty that the great Rome, as described in the old books, is the Italian Rome. As we are now beginning to understand, these books were most probably referring to the Rome on the Bosphorus. However, in the early 14th century, or even later, it was ordered to assume that the ancient manuscripts referred to the Italian Rome. Petrarch had to find field traces of the great Roman past in Italy. He searched vigorously, found nothing, and was nervous about this fact. Yeah, that would be one hell of a wake-up call, right? And it should be a wake-up call to everybody today that's into history. Where's all this stuff that's supposed to exist? The stuff that we have does not line up, technically speaking, with what the history books describe. We are missing all kinds of things that would substantiate any of the mainstream historical narrative right now. And of course, the stratigraphy also does not corroborate anything with respect to ancient Rome. Like it's that bad. Okay. However, the letters attributed to Petrarch contain traces of Roman history that differs considerably from the history we are taught nowadays. For instance, Petrarch insists that the pyramid that is now considered the Pyramid of Cestius is really the sepulchre of Remus. Could Petrarch have been correct? Really, Scaligerian history doesn't know the location of the ancient Remus. Since this pyramid was built in the alleged 12th century, it would be logical to assume that the ancient Remus could not have lived before the 12th century AD, which is a far cry from the didactic dating of the 8th century BC. This is what I'm talking about. Just in this little section alone, we find a situation that has the potential, and really should have, shifted the chronology entirely, right? There should have been a paradigm shift once this train of thought was explored. But that hasn't happened, has it? No. Whatever the hell the books say, those books are the authority. Not the physical evidence, not the archaeology, not the science, but the books that are potentially forgeries. And I'll be nice saying that because we know they are all forgeries, more or less. Yeah, you can actually make the claim, by the way, that like 99% of the books that come out of the Renaissance period that deal with ancient history, supposedly supposed to have been copies of the ancient books, there's a good chance that 99% of them are literally all garbage. And I mean that through and through. And that's a scientific perspective. That's just not me talking crap because I hate mainstream history. That's a legitimate possibility. I know it sounds crazy. That's for a different talk for a different time. But that's how bad it is. I mean, that's how horrible our history is. All right, let's keep going. The real parochial Italian Rome of the 14th century surprised the poet greatly, since it strangely failed to concur with his a priori impressions based on the interpretation of the ancient texts which he considered correct. I love this. Like, he's already having a problem. Even back then, they were like, what the hell is going on? This most probably means that he rejected other evidence contradicting this novel opinion, right? Yeah. The gigantic Colosseum, for instance, proved to be the castle and the fortress of a medieval feudal clan, and the same fate befell such, quote, ancient constructions as the mausoleum of Hadrian, the theater of Marcellus, the arch of Septimus Severus, etc. Plainly speaking, all of the ancient buildings turned out to be medieval. This presents no contradiction to us. However, for Petrarch, who had apparently already perceived Rome through the distorting prism of the erroneous chronology, this must have been extremely odd. And of course it was odd, right? I mean, that's one of the problems that I think a lot of people find when they start to read these histories, is that at the very least, subconsciously, something is telling the person, hey, this is not quite right. But, you have an authoritative figure saying that it is right. So I honestly believe this is where a lot of people drop out of history, because your average person is not stupid. They'll take this stuff in, and there will be a part of them that will say, this makes no sense. The problem is they take they take the the situation of this doesn't make any sense, as if they are too stupid to study it. And, obviously the professors and stuff will also take that attitude, but that's not what's going on at all. The reality is the people are not understanding it, not because they are stupid, but because it doesn't make sense. Like, there's no logic to it. Your average person can immediately smell the BS. And unfortunately, the BS is taught as fact. And then, of course, people bow down to authority, and then they get out of history, and then they never learn anything after that because they think that they're too stupid to do it. Okay, I don't even know why I'm talking. Okay, let's keep going. Apparently, we have thus managed to pick out the moment in the Middle Ages when the creation of the consensual, erroneous version of the history of Italian Rome began. This could not have preceded the first half of the 14th century. Although we should add that it is possible for all of these events to have occurred significantly later, namely in the 16th to 17th century AD. He's even willing to move these events further towards us. That, it's very amazing. It's a very interesting perspective. I'm not saying he's right, by the way, on moving it that far ahead, but it's not impossible. Like, if we just follow the evidence like we are right now, the conclusions that we draw are just based on evidence. And remember, facts and science does not care about our feelings. So, anyway, all right. According to Jan Parandowski, quote, Petrarch's arrival marks a new era in the assessment of the state of the great city's decline. Petrarch had been the first person of the new era whose eyes filled with tears at the very sight of the destroyed columns and at the very memory of the forgotten names, unquote. Having wiped off the tears, Petrarch became quite industrious in what concerned the creation of the quote-unquote true history of Italian Rome. He searched for statues, collected Roman medals, and tried to recreate the topography of Rome. Most of Petrarch's energy was, however, directed at finding and commenting on the oeuvres of the ancient authors. The list of books that he allegedly owned survived until our days. The list that he compiled himself in the alleged year of 1336 AD on the last page of the Latin Codex that is now kept in the National Library of Paris. Whether or not Petrarch had been in the possession of the original works of the authors remains unknown. The following names are mentioned in the list: Horace, Ovid, Catullus, Propertius, Tibullus, Persius, Juvenal, Claudian, Ovid, the comedians Plautus and Terentius, the historians Titus Livy, Salatius, Suetonius, Florus, Eutropius, Justin, Osirius, Valerius Maximus, the orators and philosophers Quintilian, Varro, Pliny, Apuleius, Aelius Gellius, Macrobius, Vitruvius, Marcian Capella, Pompeius Mela, Cassiodorus, Boetius, as well as the names of a large number of holy fathers are listed. We ask the following questions. Can we trust in Petrarch's ownership of these volumes? How was the list dated? Did Petrarch actually hold any of the oeuvres written by the above-mentioned authors in his hands, or did he just collect the names? Do we interpret Petrarch's statements correctly nowadays? After all, they reach us via a filter of the Scaligeriate editors of the 16th and 17th century. We perceive them through the glass of a distorted chronology. Petrarch's letters need to be studied again if they really are his and weren't written or edited on his behalf a great while later. One also has to emphasize that Petrarch didn't specifically occupy himself with the dating of the texts he found. He was looking for the works of the ancients, apparently without questioning whether they preceded him by 100 years, 200, or 1,000. Let's not forget that 100 years, let alone 300, is a long period of time. And that's actually a really important statement. People, or not people, well, maybe people, historians. Historians throw around like, centuries and millennium like it's nothing. Do you know how much can change within one day in history? We know for a fact that huge, significant historical events can happen in the span of a day. So when historians start just saying plus or minus 100 years or plus or minus 1,000 years, it's so stupid, this frivolous approach to the way that they date things and the way that they give averages of dates. Every single day matters. Every single year matters. If you do not have this locked down historically to an exact date, you have the potential to be completely wrong on everything. It's that simple. We don't even need to go any further. The fact that historians are willing to throw around dates like this, time periods, plus or minus 10, 20 years, plus or minus 1,000 years, that is all you need to see to know that the mainstream chronology has got to be wrong. Like that entire attitude, that entire approach to chronology is just insane. Okay. With the growth of his income, Petrarch founded a special workshop with scribes and secretaries, which he often mentions in his letters. Everyone knew about his infatuation with collecting old books. He mentions it in every letter he writes to his every friend. If you really value me, do as I tell you. Find educated and trustworthy people and let them rake through the bookcases of every scientist there is, clerical as well as secular. He pays for the findings bounteously. Remember, like I said, during this period of time, there was a huge industry for this stuff. People were getting rich off of creating this kind of documentation. And right here we have it acknowledged that he is literally paying for people to find books for him that will agree with what he's trying to do. So all a forger has to do now is say, hey, look, I've got a client. I know what he wants. I'm going to go forge something, give it to him, and he's going to pay me a lot of money to do it, right? And he's not going to question it. So they just take it as fact. I mean, that is the situation we find when Roman history is being built, all right? Okay. And they kept coming to him from all directions. That would have been the forgeries in the books that he's paying for. He makes some important discoveries himself. Thus, in the alleged year of 1333, he finds 2 previously unknown speeches of Cicero's in Liege. And in 1334, Cicero's letters to Atticus, Quintus, and Brutus in Verona. And let us remind the reader that according to the medieval legends, Cicero was a knight and a troubadour. How do you like that? How many knights do you remember riding around in ancient Rome? Precisely 0. This is the kind of problem that pops up all over the place in history, and it's a problem that mainstream historians completely ignore. But it's right there. I mean, you cannot avoid this stuff. All right. Petrarch had reasons for considering himself to be responsible for the revival of interest in the philosophical works and essays of the great Roman orator. Petrarch wrote, quote, "As soon as I see a monastery, I head that way in hope of finding some great work by Cicero," unquote. Like, isn't that funny? Like, these guys are just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go find all this famous stuff in this random monastery over here, yeah. And then, of course, they come out with it, which is even funnier. All right, anyway. The history of how he discovered the Cicero's lost tractate titled De Gloria is a very odd one indeed. Its existence became known from a letter to Atticus that is attributed to Cicero. Petrarch claimed that he had discovered this priceless manuscript, but gave it to his old friend Convenovola, who is supposed to have lost it. Yeah, nice, right? And that is so common. We always hear these people that are like, yeah, I found this really ancient manuscript, and then I copied it, but yeah, don't worry, bro. I mean, I had to send the original off somewhere else, or the original, I don't know, it just caught fire magically, dude. I mean, what do you want from me? I was sitting there, I was reading it, and then poof, it was just on fire. So you have to use the copy that I made. And that is so common that it's like unbelievable that historians do not acknowledge this stuff in today's day and age. It's insane. All right. Nowadays, Petrarch's endeavors are usually written about with great pathos. Quote, "It had really been the first one of those glorious expeditions, rich in discoveries, that shall be undertaken by the humanists of the generations to follow, who have journeyed like Columbus in their search for parchments gobbled by numerous rats." Cicero's letters were allegedly discovered by Petrarch in the chapter library of Verona, where no one had been aware of their existence. For some reason, the original was soon lost by Petrarch, and he demonstrated a copy instead. Unquote. What do you want from me, man? The evidence is right there. I don't know what else to say to people who believe the mainstream chronology. Okay. Another dude wrote that. Not another dude. R.I. Klodowski wrote, quote, "Petrarch proved a natural-born philologist. He had been the first to study the oeuvres of the ancient Roman poets, comparing different copies and using data provided by the neighboring historical sciences. It was Petrarch, the philologist, who had destroyed the medieval legend of Virgil, the mage and sorcerer, and accused the author of the Aeneid, of a number of anachronisms. He had deprived Seneca of several works that were ascribed to him in the Middle Ages, and proved the apocryphal character of Caesar's and Nero's letters, which had a great political meaning in the middle of the 14th century, since it gave authority to the empire's claim for Austria." Unquote. Right there. And if you ever want to know why anybody would forge any kind of an ancient document, like how could somebody ever do something like that, that's all you need. All you need is human greed and their lust for power. And that is exactly what we find during this period in history. We find between 1200 AD and 1800 AD countless forgeries just popping out of everywhere, making sure that the people who are in charge stay in charge. I mean, that's okay. This is where the really important motives become clear to us. The ones that Petrarch may have been truly guided by in his archaeological endeavors. These motives were political. As we have just explained, we have ourselves been witnesses to countless examples from contemporary history when science was used as a basis for one political claim or another. And sorry, science was in quotes, right? It's like nowadays, right? Trust the science. Just believe in the science, bigot. Don't question anything. We're right, you're wrong. We're the experts. You know, all those buzzwords, those are all psychological conditioning buzzwords, by the way. Those are trigger points that have been embedded into Western society. I'm not going to get into that. Okay. This makes chronology largely irrelevant. However, today, when the characters of that epic have long left the stage, we must return to the issue of just how preposterous the letters of Caesar and Nero were, and what was wrong with the medieval legends of Virgil. The poet's attitude to the ancient documents was far from critical analysis. Petrarch's declarations of antiquity may have been made for meeting the conditions of some political order of the Reformation epoch in the Western European area. This would have been between the 16th and 17th century AD. The order was given to create a dichotomy between barbaric contemporaneity and beauteous antiquity. At any rate, one clearly sees that either Petrarch or someone else acting on his behalf was creating the mythical world of the antiquity without bothering about the exact epoch when Cicero's speeches were written, and whether it had preceded that of Petrarch by 200 years or 1400 years. It is possible that all of this activity really took place in the 16th and 17th century and not the 14th century during the Reformation in the Western Europe, and was arcly shifted into the 14th century and ascribed to Petrarch so that it would gain the authority of antiquity. The reality of the 16th and 17th century, which Petrarch cites as the antithesis of ancient civilization, was later baptized feudal barbarianism. Isn't this crazy? Like, even Petrarch's being messed around, even who Petrarch was, is being played with respect to chronology to give him and his writings, which are all garbage probably, some, or not all garbage, but a lot of it probably is, or a lot of the books that he promotes is all, forgeries and stuff. But even his character alone is also being tossed backwards in time to give him some sort of an authority so that when people reference Petrarch, they can say, oh yeah, see, it's ancient, this guy was already knowing about this, he already wrote about it, so this land is ours, for example. Right? I mean, that's the extent to where this went. It's crazy. All right, we're going to do this last little section. It continues with Petrarch stuff. It's only 2 more pages, and then I'll let you guys go. Last little section, 4.2. Petrarch's private correspondence with people considered ancient characters nowadays. Oh, this will be a good one. We proceed to encounter facts that seem to defy all reason. Apparently, Petrarch writes a letter to Titus Livy. The commentators of today try to assure us that this private letter, written by the medieval Petrarch to the ancient Titus Livy, is but a manifestation of the poet's exalted imagination, since poets are supposed to be fantasy-prone in general. We all know that. It's a scientific fact that if you are a poet, you are just going to be frivolously writing about random stuff, and you will never write about real life, right? That's literally what mainstream thinks. It's absolutely insane. We are told that Petrarch communed with characters from the distant past, as if they were his contemporaries. His letters to the heroes of the distant past are thus not to be taken literally. What is the truth here? Could such a letter simply mean that Petrarch and Titus Livy were contemporaries, and that the 14th century original was later altered by the Scaligeriate editors of the 16th and 17th century in order to sever Livy from Petrarch and then send the former into a distant epoch? Petrarch is supposed to have made remarks of great pathos, such as, quote, "Oh, why did destiny deny me life in your age? My sweetest dreams, I see myself living amongst the greatest of men, and not the thieves and rogues that surround me nowadays," unquote. And further on, quote, "Ancient studies have always been a matter of great interest and importance to me, and I have pursued them with great zeal. For the time I live in had always seemed loathsome to me, and so I have always wanted to have been born in another age and forget about this one, and have always tried to let my soul live in different epochs," unquote. This letter to Titus Livy is far from being the only such example. Modern Petrarch scholars point out a peculiar facet of his epistolary legacy that they fail to comprehend. Petrarch wrote quite a few letters to his contemporaries, and it turns out that in his Latin correspondence, he tried, as we are now being convinced, to deliberately obfuscate medieval reality, referring to antiquity instead. We proceed to learn that Petrarch used ancient names and nicknames, Socrates, Lelius, Olympius, Simonide, etc. His letters have an air of antiquity about them in the modern interpretation of Staggering chronology. That is to say, he wrote as if he had lived in the classical age. We are told nowadays that he deliberately Latinized his letters to make them explicitly ancient. He allegedly even obscured current events from sight, dressing them in ancient garments. This is crazy. So basically what he's saying is that Titus Livy did not live in an ancient past. Titus Livy was probably just one of his friends that he was writing to, and that mainstream history decided that they would throw Titus Livy way back in the past, and then what that does is that makes Petrarch's letters, he's not talking to a living person, he's pretending to talk to a living person back in the past. Like, how does that even make sense? Who the hell would... There's no reason to believe that. He doesn't make that claim anywhere, by the way. Petrarch. Petrarch never says, oh yeah, I'm just here to be a poet and I'm gonna make up a bunch of stuff and pretend that I'm writing back in the day. No! The way he is writing is the way they wrote during the time he lived. Titus Livy is not an ancient character. Titus Livy was live during Petrarch's time period. The letters that was exchanged, these letters are real letters. Like, this was actually being talked. Okay, all right. I want to finish this because I'm going to get extremely angry soon. Okay. We have the following comment to make. Apparently, the pages of Petrarch's letters, even after being caringly edited in the 16th and 17th century, demonstrate to us the true epic of the 14th century, which, as we see, was the classical age that Scaligerite chronologers hastened to send into the distant past. This makes their heirs of today resort to theories about Petrarch being deliberate in his attempts to make medieval contemporaneity resemble antiquity. That is to say, he isn't supposed to be taken literally. Like that, it's like, okay, but this is all cope, by the way. This is not a fact. This is what mainstream historians have to do to keep the visage of garbage history. Because if they admit that the way Titus Livy is actually talking to Plutarch or Petrarch, Plutarch might actually be Petrarch, by the way. Sorry, same person more than likely. That's another show. Probably not another show. There, now you have it. Plutarch was Petrarch. That's that whole thing. Okay. Anyways, but isn't that crazy? The amount of garbage that the mainstream has to make up to try to hide all the discrepancies that are right there on the surface. This is like literally History 101, that you can point out the weirdness, but then your history teacher will be like, no, don't pay attention to that. He was just imagining he lived back in the day. Yeah, right. And the fact that we find him being thrown back 300 years before his own time as well is hilarious. The duplications, the triplications of history throughout chronology, mainstream chronology, it affects everything. And it's funny, even the little things get messed with, like Plutarch here, or Petrarch. It's crazy. Okay. We shall summarize, reiterating that there had most probably been no false fronts here. Petrarch wrote letters to his contemporaries whose names were ancient, because he and his colleagues were living in the classical age, which may really have fallen on the first half of the 14th century or even later, and all of the quote-unquote ancient characters bearing such names as Titus Livy, Socrates, Laelius, Olympius, etc., were Petrarch's actual contemporaries. This point of view eliminates many oddities from his biography. Isn't that interesting that once you just get rid of the garbage and the BS, suddenly everything starts to make logical sense? And that's the problem for historians, right? Because what Fomenko is pointing out here is logically and scientifically correct. Like, what do you even do against this, right? It's even just basic common sense. That is what's being used here. If Petrarch was writing letters to somebody called Titus Livy using a very particular language, it's entirely possible that that is just the way they spoke during that period of time. Why the hell would they go out of their way to, like, I don't know, I guess role play or something? Like, we have no reason to believe these guys were role playing as classical Romans. It's far more likely that they were what we consider the classical Romans, right? And there's the evidence. All right, we're almost done. Furthermore, Petrarch wrote a series of biographies titled The Lives of Famous Men. This appears to be a kind of repetition of the work of the ancient Plutarch titled Comparative Biographies. Oh, okay, he might talk about that here, okay. One wonders whether Plutarch might have merely been a different name of Petrarch's. It is well known that the sounds R and L were often subject to flexion in old texts, which may have made the name of Plutarch sound like Prutarch, which sounds similar to the name Petrarch. Thus, Petrarch may well have gathered a doppelganger on the pages of the medieval chronicles, who was exiled into the distant past under the name of Plutarch. That actually brings up another good point. One of the tricks that was used when these forgers would duplicate or triplicate history, or not even a trick, one of the accidents that could happen was literally just not fully appreciating and or understanding the accent that the name was being spoken with. So if somebody, speaks with a very certain inflection, then if you were to literally write down how that person talks, it's not going to be spelled the same way as it does in the standard way that it should have been said, or the standard way that it would be written literally, right? So this is a problem for accidental history as well. It's not just forgeries that do this stuff, but that's how easy it is to get stuff confused, right? So if I were to hear somebody speaking in French and I tried to write that down in an English situation, the way I would spell French words in pure English is not going to translate directly to French, or at least not all of it would. You see what I'm saying? Like, there would be problems with respect to what is being written down. And this is actually probably one of the reasons why, I think it was Plato. Was it Plato that didn't write anything down? I don't remember. Whoever didn't want to write stuff down. Socrates. I think it was Socrates. They didn't want to write anything down because they believed that if you were going to get the information, you should get it from a person who knows it so that you can clear up any of the potential problems, right? So if you're giving me information and we're talking and I have a question, I can ask you directly and you can clarify that information. You can't do that necessarily with written texts. And then if you have, hundreds and hundreds of years of written text being copied, forged, manipulated, different languages, translations, etc., you're going to find names of places, peoples, etc., changed, even though they're all technically maybe referring to the exact same thing. So that's the Petrarch-Plutarch situation right there. Okay. Nearly all of Petrarch's heroes are to be found among the eminent statesmen of the ancient Republic Rome, namely the ancient Junius Brutus, Horace Cocles, Camillus, Manlius Torquatus, Fabricius, Fabius Maximus, Cato the Elder, Scipio Africanus. Nowadays, it is assumed that Petrarch's sources were the works of Titus Livy, Suetonius, Justin, Florus, and Caesar. Is this really so? Could Petrarch or Plutarch have merely written a series of biographies of his contemporaries? In other words, all of the ancient characters listed above must have lived in the epoch of the 12th to 16th century. And it was only much later that the Scaligeriate editors of the 16th and 17th century raked through these medieval biographies, inserting remarks that transferred them into the distant past, which may have created an ancient reflection of the medieval Petrarch by the name of Plutarch. Finally, we shall cite two portraits of Petrarch, or Plutarch, from a medieval book allegedly dating from 1388. It is therefore possible that more or less accurate graphical representations of the ancient Plutarch have reached our age. And I'm going to post this up here if you guys can check it out. One of the problems that we see in a lot of these representations of people in the medieval times, they represent people who are supposed to be like ancient Roman, but they put them in medieval clothing, for example, right? And the mainstream says, oh, this was just a love for the anachronisms. Really? We have no reason to believe that, by the way. There's nowhere anywhere that says, oh yeah, it's a huge fad to make all the ancient people dress like medieval people in our portraits. There's nothing like that. It's entirely possible that these medieval portraits are literally depicting the people who are supposed to be thousands of years old, but instead actually lived more closely to modern times. In this case, the 16th-ish century. Just saying, this is a legitimate possibility. So these portraits may be actually representing the real Petrarch or Plutarch, and not some weird ancient distant figure that they're just dressing up in medieval clothing because they're crazy and they think it's funny. That's not happening. All right, we're done. Just more historical and scientific proof that our chronology is completely wrong. So if we look at this and we realize that we have to date what we consider classical Rome, not in the BC area, but in like the 14th century AD, yeah, that changes everything, doesn't it? Now, I know it initially sounds crazy, but what do you want? The evidence is the evidence. We can't work around that. We have to pay attention to what is there. The good news is that once we take this stuff seriously, suddenly a lot of other historical problems no longer become problems. But this is a tough exercise, and I realize that. Because, the reality is we all have a lot of psychological programming put into us that will immediately build up psychological defenses against concepts like what we just read. So I'm not saying, blindly believe it. Go test it for yourself. Go do the research, but ask real questions. Don't ask softball questions. Ask real hard questions and then demand an answer. Don't let a historian just hand wave you away. Don't let some, huge thick book that tries to make up all these excuses for something, get rid of you. No, demand 100% scientific proof for all of your questions. Once you do that, you're going to find that history completely changes. And of course, the mainstream chronology immediately crumbles. Okay. All right, we're done. You get it. You get it. Just ask better questions. That's what life is about. Ask better questions. It gets better. Oh.